Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The first story is about the discovery of a nematode with a ridiculous resistance to arsenic and an unusual expression of sexes. In one of the places you'd expect to find the weird and unusual, California, Mono Lake has what can best be described as unusual samples of its life. Specifically, researchers from the California Institute of Technology found 8 species of microscopic worm that thrive in this environment, one of which is called an Anema species. It expresses 3 different sexes and can exist in environments that have 500 times the dose of arsenic that would kill a human, let alone a microscopic worm. Unlike humans and most other species, nematodes do not have a binary. Instead, they have either a male of the species or a hermaphrodite for the species. For those who do not know, hermaphrodites are both male and female. Further to this, the worm gives birth to live young. This could all be a product of the fact that it is an extremophile. Extremophiles are a way of describing a species that can survive in an environment that is otherwise inhospitable towards life, such as somewhere rich in arsenic. However, these particular nematodes do not live in an environment rich in arsenic, and therefore it raises questions about why they have acquired this particular trait. It is thought that the species may be living in an environment high in phosphate. Phosphate, and particularly phosphate transporters, are one of the systems that are targeted by arsenic. If the species is being able to modulate its phosphate uptake, that would in turn impart resistance to arsenic. In another example of species being weird and surprising people, a tugboat of the Russian Navy has been sunk by a rather angry walrus. The Altai was found in the Franz Josef archipelago, which is part of the Arctic region. It was carrying researchers from the Geographical Society, and, being in such an inhospitable environment, there are many dangers. Generally speaking, walruses are on that list, but only sit in the middle. They are large, territorial, and able to do a lot of damage. The Russian Geographical Society's crew was being ferried from the Altai to land via smaller craft. It is one of these smaller craft that the female walrus, after becoming aggravated, managed to sink. Fortunately, all hands were saved, and all members of the Geographical Society made land. The Russian Navy has not had much to say on this topic. However, the Geographical Society has made known what happened, and to a certain extent given all credit to survival of the crew to the Russian Navy's. If you are being chased by a very large and angry walrus, you could be forgiven for winding up with heart dysfunction. However, one case study coming to us, care of the British Medical Journal, describes how one 60-year-old woman wound up with heart dysfunction after mistaking wasabi for avocado. Through some yet unexplained misfortune, the woman ate the wasabi and felt pressure in her chest, which radiated to her arms. This lasted for hours. Despite this, she decided not to leave the wedding she was attending, and waited for the pain to go away. The next day it had not yet left, and she felt general discomfort, leading to her wanting medical care. She was diagnosed with takotsubo cardiomyopathy, more commonly known as broken heart syndrome, which is where the left ventricle becomes weaker temporarily due to stress, presumably the stress of eating the rather spicy wasabi. Despite knowing what condition the elderly lady had, it's still unknown how the food caused it, since it was not a case of severe anaphylaxis. Fortunately, after a month, the elderly woman has recovered and, in all likelihood, will be keeping a close eye out for any food that is green. In another case study coming care of the New England Journal of Medicine this time, a 25-year-old woman came to the emergency room when she was weak, dizzy, and experiencing short breath. Her doctors found a more immediate concern. That was, she seemed to be physically blue, as in the color blue, as though she were suffocating. Beyond the outward signs of hypoxia, her blood had turned a dark color by contrast to the more standard reddish dark red color. Considering how she presented and the symptoms the doctors noted, this sounds like it could end badly. Fortunately, the doctors could figure out what was happening very quickly. She had a rare and possibly fatal condition called Methemoglobinemia. This is a condition in which hemoglobin molecules change shape. This creates a problem with the release of oxygen. Particularly, it retards it. This has comparable effects to suffocation, in so much as even if oxygen were to enter the body, it could not be used. Although prospectively hereditary, that tends to be a much rarer form of the condition, and in this case, it was triggered by a topical medication used for toothache. It is a medication called benzocaine, and is the active ingredient in a number of over-the-counter medications. The complications of this particularly easily accessed medicine are well understood, and has led to the FDA issuing a number of warnings. Fortunately, both because the method of action and the cause of the condition are well understood, there is a treatment available, and it is called methylene blue. It returns the hemoglobin to its normal shape, which in turn allows the delivery of oxygen, or perhaps more accurately, the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. Hematological tests later revealed that nearly half of the hemoglobin in the woman's body had been affected by this topical medication. That is, she was getting nearly half of the oxygen she would normally receive, explaining why she was short of breath. If she had gone over the 50% threshold, there was a chance of long-term damage to heart, lungs, brain, and other important organs, and at the extreme end, death. Fortunately for this lady, she only needed to be in hospital for one night and received 2 doses of the methylene blue before being discharged. Going now from the weird and unusual case studies to promising but unexpected clinical trials. One in particular that focuses on Alzheimer's treatment using electromagnetic waves. It is a very small pilot study that involved 8 patients and 2 months. Therefore, calling it preliminary is likely generous. The patients were fitted with a device that looks very interesting. This was meant to help with retention of their memory by emitting a small custom flow of electromagnetic waves. This was applied twice daily for an hour each time. Unlike other treatments, this could be done at home, in comfort, at the patient's leisure. The clinical trial led to the publication of a paper that shows there are results worth looking into. These have been peer-reviewed and evaluated. In and of itself, that is a good sign. However, it is worth noting that two of the authors behind the peer-reviewed paper have invested heavily into the company that has developed this device. Naturally, that adds a considerable amount of salt that needs to be taken with the publication. As a rule, Alzheimer's is caused by the collection of amyloid beta and tau proteins that create knots within the brain and prevent the stable communication. Being within the brain, most pharmacological interventions struggle to gain access specifically to these bundles of protein, the blood-brain barrier being the very first issue that comes up, followed by getting an adequate dose without damaging other targets. And then you have to consider how frequently, stability, and more for any medication used. This study showed the equivalent of rolling back 1 year's worth of damage with 2 months' worth of treatment, and over the longer term, it may show improvement or at least an ability to slow down the degradation of the brain. It could also be shown to be an unreliable model, biased sample size, or something else that will crop up and undermine these initial findings. But as it is a promising line of inquiry. The next story may greatly diminish your belief in humanity. If you believe the lead in bullets is the only thing killing people, then you should look to India, particularly turmeric, especially by those who are questionable business people and may be adulterating their turmeric that they sell with other possible herbs, spices, or fillers. For this reason, the study looking into the rural area of Bangladesh has found an extremely high exposure rate, especially among women and children. In fact, up to half of all of the studied residents of this area had extremely elevated levels of lead in their system. Lead is a well-known neurotoxin, with there being historical examples that are well known going all the way back to the Roman Empire, where it was thought to some degree that lead plumbing contributed to the degradation of the society and, ultimately, the madness of the ruling class. At least in rural Bangladesh, there has been some confusion since 2014 as to why the residents had such a high lead content in their blood, and they've isolated part of the source, turmeric. Some of the samples they have taken are up to 500 times the legal limit. In and of itself, that is not a smoking gun. However, what the researchers were able to do was take the isotopes of the turmeric-based lead, and that found in the blood of people, and find that they overlapped almost exactly, meaning that the source and the final destination have the same basic contaminant. This is important as it is a serious neurological toxin and can cause both long-term effects for those who consume it as an adult and, particularly with regards to pregnant women and fetuses, can severely and drastically adversely affect the development of the child in utero and in later life. In an example of less malignant but certainly equally unintended harm, one example of herpes infection has occurred following ritual Jewish circumcision. A baby has been diagnosed with neonatal herpes after they had direct contact between the person conducting the circumcision and the foreskin that was removed. The case was reported to the health department in September 2019. The last instance of something similar occurring was back in March of 2017, which makes it seem like it might be an irregular event. However, the treatment for this requires the infant be hospitalized and have a 14-day course of intravenous medication given. The decline in incidence since 2006, when reporting became mandatory, could be a combination of factors including greater knowledge, the compulsory reporting of this, and things like a change in cultural practices. The total 164 laboratory-confirmed diagnoses is a disconcerting number, and a further 12% of these developed infections specifically from ritual circumcision. This is largely an example of an unintended consequence of an otherwise seemingly harmless activity that has significant cultural and social significance. As a result, the health department has been distributing information trying to make parents aware of the possible implications of their choices. However, a very disconcertingly large proportion of parents report not having seen any of this information. Briefly touching on India once more, they have begun banning all e-cigarettes as a consequence of fear over youth consumption. India has stated that they are initiating the complete ban as a result of health concerns. This follows on from the 7 people who have died in America over contaminants in vaping products. In related news of a hidden pandemic that is just waiting to crop up, a report from the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board has said there is a good chance of a pandemic that could kill up to 80 million people in the foreseeable future. The report primarily criticizes the fact that this major health crisis is impending, and that the world is woefully unprepared for it. Consider how poorly the world reacted to things like SARS in the last 20 years. Then compare this going all the way back to the Spanish flu. There has been repeated examples from even earlier than that humanity often struggles with pandemics, and if it is a fast-moving, relatively lethal, but not excessively so disease, our globalization could easily lead to its spreading and removing nearly 5% of the world's economy and up to 80 million people before we begin to get it under control. The same report also identifies 7 possible ways the world could take action to reduce the probability and impact of such a catastrophic event. The researchers for that particular report highlight the world tends to have a reactionary approach, where for a brief time, countries and politicians will invest heavily into research into healthcare, public health, and disease prevention. Then they will neglect it, allowing things to simmer for a while and then rise up once more. This has been previously dealt with in other situations, such as the war on drugs, by aggressively fighting it on a long-term basis. More often than not, those efforts have failed due to a lack of funding, a lack of resources, or a lack of ability to make impact. In some countries, the world is now turning away from the war on drugs as an example, and this has been shown in Australia, where the capital state and city, Canberra, has just legalized the consumption of recreational cannabis. This creates an oxymoron, given that Canberra is the federal capital of Australia, but this also goes against federal law. Cannabis for medical use has been approved several years ago, and Australia started to roll out facilities for the production and processing of cannabis for medication. There has also been a long-term undercurrent to society of recreational use for cannabis. The simple summary of the law allows for 2 plants per person or 4 per household, and the possession of up to 50 grams of cannabis on a person. Under current law, growing the plant alone is illegal, but you could possess up to 50 grams and receive a relatively small fine of $160. If you had more than that, you would pay $8,000 and prospectively go to prison. As mentioned earlier, this creates a conflict, and it is unclear at present whether or not federal law enforcement will arrest those who are otherwise legally cultivating their drugs, or if they'll be left to their own devices so long as they follow the law as it is written. Further to that, the federal government may actually step in and intervene as they have in the past. At one point in recent years, the Australian Capital Territory, which hosts Canberra, legalized same-sex marriage. However, the federal government took the state to court over this and won a ruling that prevented them from legalizing this due to constitutional reasons. It is unclear whether or not they will do something similar with this legislature. On a global scale, global warming or climate change, however you choose to describe it, has exposed a 4,000-year-old version of Stonehenge in Spain. The Valdecanas Reservoir in Spain contained tall pillars made of stone that were occasionally observable from the shore as the waterline dropped. After months of drought in Spain, the reservoir's water level has fallen to such a point where it exposed the entire structure. It is made of 150 stones arranged in an oval shape, and it is called the Dolmen of Guadalperal. It was built in the Copper or Bronze Age by locals. It was rediscovered in the 1920s, before it was buried in the 1960s with the construction of a dam. With the possibility of rising water once more, there is both a Change.org petition and a general effort to relocate this structure, which is not an unheard of thing in the past, with Egypt in particular working to move temples, shrines, and other archaeologically significant sites away from water and therefore preserving them for future use. At the minute, there is no effort to do that in Spain specifically, and some believe that the site should be left as is. In other climate-related news, Amazon's trees are growing at a rate that we've not seen before. In fact, they're growing 50% bigger than they have previously, and there is little to explain why and how this is occurring. One example in particular stands at 88 meters tall, more than 30 meters taller than the last record holder. All the trees found as published were over 70 meters tall and of the species Angelum vermellum. It is a commonly used timber, but also possesses a pungent odor. The examples of it found to date have led researchers to believe it would only grow to 60 meters tall under existing circumstances. Based on what has been seen and found in these and other studies, there is some belief that the higher carbon content of the atmosphere may be contributing to this to some extent. This gives rise to other concerns, considering that each tree can hold a vast amount of carbon. That is the equivalent of between 300 and 500 smaller trees of the same species, but only taking up the space of about 20, leading to between a 15 and 25-fold improvement from a single tree. This leads researchers to believe that the Amazon rainforest may be a far more significant carbon sink than previously considered. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.